This example is going to discuss just the basics of relative versus absolute cell addresses in Microsoft Excel. In the example you see here on the screen, we simply have a bunch of people with their hours worked, and we wanted a formula to calculate what their pay would be. So as you can see here in this example, we took cell C2 and we multiplied it times the pay rate. Well, to get this formula for every one of the employees, we had to take each one of their individual hours. In this case, for Ann, we had to take cell C3 and again multiply it times the pay rate. These are all what they refer to as relative cell references. Relative cell references simply point in the direction of where the target cell is. So in this particular case, for instance, C4 is one cell to the left in that same row. E2 is 2 rows up and one column to the right. Now most people don't understand this very clearly, and so as you can see here, the person had to type every one of these formulas individually rather than just copying and pasting. And if you had copied and pasted this formula, I'll just fill this, well, I'm not going to fill it down, but if you copied and pasted it down, you'd see that the E2 would actually have changed to E3 and then E4 and then E5 and E6, and you kind of scratch your head and figure out what the heck, and then you go back and you type in all the formulas just as you see here individually, and you get the right answers. Well, the problem with this, of course, is that it's very time consuming, and it will often lead to errors because you're typing in every one of these formulas, and in a long spreadsheet you're going to probably make some typing mistakes. So this is really the wrong way to do things. Let's take a look at the correct way to do things. This example shows a relative cell address and then an absolute cell address. The C2 is relative, pointing one cell to the left in the same row, and the E2 points over here at the pay rate. Now this formula could be actually just filled down with the fill handle, and that formula would have actually resulted in what you see here on the screen. The relative addresses would have all been updated to point to the one cell to the left. As you can see here, every one of these points one cell to the left. But the absolute address stayed on E2. It never changed as the formula was filled down to the bottom. So essentially, in this particular case, all we had to do is type in the correct formula once, fill it down, and we were finished. So the advantage you see here is that it's very fast. You just type in one formula and fill it down. And it's generally going to be error-free because you're simply copying the same formula all the way down. You're not doing a bunch of typing. So this is a critical skill when you're learning how to use Microsoft Excel. Let's take a look at more detail on this. So here's the same situation where we have cell references. C9 points one cell to the left, C10 one cell to the left. And so if we were to fill these values down, if I clicked on this formula and just filled it down, essentially what it would do is it would change everything, C9, C10, C11, and I get all the resulting values, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down to 8, just as you see here. Now over here I have an absolute reference to C9. The absolute reference is indicated, you see, with the dollar signs here. And when I fill that down, it just repeats the C9 all the way down because an absolute reference will never change. It's not an offset. It's an absolute reference to a particular cell. And so in this case, of course, all those would have resulted in just the value of 1. So the basic idea here is that a relative cell address is an offset. It points at a particular location. In this particular case, on the very first example, again, C2 points one cell to the left. So if I copy that down, I'm going to get a resulting C3 because it's still got to point one cell to the left. Down here, all the way to the bottom, C6 points one cell to the left. it's an offset. Whereas the absolute references always point to a specific cell. So by putting those dollar signs in there, we're saying that the row and column, the column E and the row 2, are always going to be fixed. When I copy and paste that formula, the row and column will always be fixed, pointing at the same place. So let's think about a rule we could follow to do absolute versus relative cell references. The basic idea here is you really only need to think about it if you're going to copy one or more of your cells. In other words, if you're going to put a formula in, like I did up here for the pay, I'm going to want to copy that down to the many people that I have in my list. So that formula is going to be copied. That's the most efficient way to do this. So you only need to consider this absolute business when you're talking about copying a cell with a bunch of formulas in it, or a formula in it. So if you're going to copy, so that's the big question, if you're going to do the copy, you then need to consider each cell address in your formula. And you have to ask one question: should the cell address be absolute? Always referring to the same exact location. So in this particular case up here, when I'm typing that in, I typed in C2, and I say to myself, do I want that always to point at Tim's hours worked when I copy that down? For example, would I want it to point to Tim's hours worked when I'm down here on Ann's row? Of course not. You want that relative reference to point to the left. So when I copy it down, I want it to point to the left and get Ann's hours worked. And I keep copying it down, I want it to point one cell to the left and get Kelly's hours worked. So that cell address would be left relative. Then I come over here and I enter the E2 and I ask myself the same question. Do I want that always to point at the same location? Well, the pay rate's in cell E2. It will never be anywhere else. So in every formula, I want it to be E2. All the way down, I want it to be E2. So to effect that, I simply put those dollar signs in. And the shortcut for putting those dollar signs in there is hitting the F4 key. The F4 key will actually automatically put the dollar signs in. You could type them manually if you wish, but the F4 key is a nice convenience. On some laptop computers, you might have to hold the function key down and then hit your F4 key to get that to work. Let's take a look at an example. Here's an example where I wanted to calculate my revenues as they increased over the years. I also want to calculate my expenses as they increase over the years. And then I just calculated the net income. Well, starting in 2010, I had a revenue of $1,000 and an expense of $1,100. And I'm going to make an assumption that my revenues are going to increase 12% a year. My expenses will increase 8% a year. So that means I needed a formula in this cell that gives me a 12% increase over the prior year. So that formula has to take the prior year and then add to that the 12% increase. Well, let's take a look at that formula. So here's the prior year, C6. It points one cell to the left. And I multiply it times 1 plus the percent increase. So that gives me 112%, if you will. So notice the absolute reference here to E12. Or I'm sorry, E10. And so E10 is always going to point here at this 12%. It'll never change. And so I enter that formula. And I use the fill handle and fill that formula across to all my additional cells in the revenues row. And it copies that formula. And if I look at the formula now, you'll notice it says D6, one cell to the left, times 1 plus E10. Again, the E10 is always going to be pointing at that 12%. Again, I can look all the way across, clear out to this last one, and it says H6, one cell to the left, times the 112%, the E10. So it's the same story with my expenses. I want a formula that takes the prior year and adds the 8%. So there's my formula, C7, prior year, times 1 plus the 8%, 8% in E11. I enter that formula I fill that across, and I'm finished. All the way across, it gives me the same formula. One cell to the left, relative reference, times 1 plus the absolute reference to the 8%. So that's a simple example of how quick and easy it is to use relative and absolute references appropriately. The final formula here is simply a subtraction, so there's nothing mysterious about that. Again, the advantage of doing this is that you enter one formula and then you fill it over to many cells, and it's fast. Also, I don't have to type, which is prone to error. So if you are going to be working much with spreadsheets, you absolutely need to learn how to use relative and absolute cell addresses.